everybody, it's Eric Pappenfuss. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day, and today we have a guest filmer in Olivia. Say hi to everybody, Olivia.
Hello.
Hey! All right, at any rate, today we're going to talk about banned books. And not just any banned book, but the granddaddy of them all, and that's Ulysses. Because I was down in Baltimore last week, and I found a rare copy, and bought it, of course, and brought it back to Harrisburg. And here it is in all of its glory. We've got a nicely leather-bound copy of Ulysses. Now, the first thing you need to know about Ulysses, Olivia, is that Joyce was unable to publish this in the United States, or in Britain for that matter, because when it appeared in excerpts in a magazine in 1920, it was deemed obscene and offensive, and the magazines were confiscated, and no publisher would touch it. So he was in Paris, wandering the streets, when he came upon a very interesting little bookstore called Shakespeare and Company, which is still there today. I've been there. If you ever go to Paris, you're going to want to go to Shakespeare and Company. It's not in the same location that it was at the time of Joyce, but the bookstore is still there. And he came upon a proprietor by the name of Sylvia Beach. Now, Sylvia Beach was an American expatriate living in Paris, and she had just opened the store, and she was friends with Hemingway and many different authors. And she said, you know what, I'll publish Ulysses. Let's do it. Because there weren't the same obscenity laws in Paris, and Joyce was thrilled, and they published it. And one of the interesting things about this book is that it has, basically, if you can look in on that, it has all the printing information for each of the various Shakespeare and Company editions, starting in 1922, which he published the first one, and going all the way up through this one, which was 1927. And all the initial copies of Ulysses were published by Sylvia Beach in Paris. Now, what makes this book even more interesting, Olivia, is that inside the book was a copy of Sylvia Beach's business card, which I think is really cool. So that is an original bookmark type card from Shakespeare & Co. from the 1920s. And as you see, it was both a bookshop and a lending library. So they had that thing where you could borrow a book if you didn't want to buy it. They broke for lunch, which is good. Do you think we should do that today? Just
yeah.
Right. And then they were open again in the evenings. And believe it or not, the card is worth more than the book. So there are phenomenal Joyce collectors, and people really are really interested in the card, even more so than this, because it's a later edition. However, I sold the card immediately to a friend of the scholar who is a Joyce collector. And he told us, you know what, this book is not what it seems. You're really lucky, Eric, because this was not published in Paris. This was actually a pirated American edition, and is in fact the first American edition of Ulysses, which was actually published in New York City in 1929. And how do you know that? Well, because two things. One, the quality of the paper is different than the French copies, but you wouldn't know that unless you had another copy of Ulysses to compare. But they made a typo here at the beginning of the book where they say by the same writer. They misspelled the name of the publisher, Jonathan Cape. They left out the A. Do you see that? There's just Jonathan Cape, not Jonathan Cape. That is called an issue point, and that is proof that this is the pirated American edition. So now let's talk a little bit about why it had to be pirated in the United States. Well, I told you it was considered obscene, and there was a court trial that took place under what was called the Comstock Act at the time. So last week's Spy Day was about the great Chicago fire and the rebuilding in the aftermath of the fire. Well, one of the things that happened in the United States in 1873 in the aftermath of the fire was the passage of the Comstock Act. There was a gentleman in New York City by the name of Anthony Comstock, and he was a sort of postal inspector, and he did not like anything that he considered lewd or lascivious. He also did not like women very much, and he certainly was against contraception and birth control. So you couldn't publish a Margaret Sanger book, and you certainly couldn't publish Ulysses. And he enforced it, and he took Joyce to trial, and the judge agreed. Now, what's interesting about this court case is that the defense, Joyce's defense, had the most interesting legal argument I've ever heard. They said, well, you can't consider Ulysses obscene. You know why? You want to take a guess, Olivia? because nobody understands it. It's impossible to understand the book. It's this sort of surrealistic modern argument, and they put a Freudian scholar on and another literary scholar on to talk about it. And the judge basically said, could you all please speak in terms that I understand? And then there's this great quote from the judge. Well, this sounds to me like the ravings of a disordered mind. I can't see why anyone would want to publish it. Obscene. And it stayed that way all throughout the 1920s. I think in honor of banned books, we have to read a little bit of each of the banned books I'm going to show you today, and you can tell me whether you find this to be obscene. Now, I'm going to read the very end. You can put a spoiler alert on if you want, but I don't think it's going to hurt today. Have you ever read Ulysses? People don't really read Ulysses today. It's one of those books that everyone knows about. This is all one sentence, so I'm just going to have to jump in and just give you a little bit, okay? Here we go. How he kissed me under the Moorish wall, and I thought, well him as another. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes. And then he asked me, would I, yes, to say, yes, my mountain flower. And first I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me, so he could feel my breasts all perfumed, yes. And his heart was going like mad, and yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. Well, that was considered obscene. I think it's actually rather beautiful, and today you can buy that on T-shirts and everything if you go to the Joyce homestead. One of the sad things about Andrew Comstock, and I don't want to make too much of him, is that he actually discovered that this book was being printed in New York surreptitiously, and he raided the warehouse and he destroyed several thousand copies of this first American edition. So it's actually doubly rare. It's the first American edition, and it's one of the few that escaped. And then eventually, in the early 30s, Random House was able to publish a copy of Ulysses because they took it back to court, and they won the court case this time. They got a sympathetic judge that said, well, it's art. It's not obscene. And what's interesting is that Bennett Cerf, who was leading Random House at the time, actually used the pirated edition, this edition, as the basis for the Random House edition. So the Random House edition reproduces the same errors that are in this edition because he couldn't get an actual copy from Shakespeare & Co. Pretty cool. Two other books I'll show you real quickly. In the Warehouse, where the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice destroyed the copies of Ulysses. You know what else they found? They found Lady Chatterley's Lover. And if you're not familiar with Lady Chatterley's Lover, that is a great book by D.H. Lawrence, which we stock at the Scholar today, but D.H. Lawrence had to have it printed privately. So he avoided even attempting to find a publisher. He just went straight to having it privately published. And then after it was privately published and sold to his subscribers, a number of individuals pirated it, including in New York, and then you have a pirated edition. And then much like Ulysses, they did it so quickly. This one's particularly bad, though, Olivia, because they misspelled Chatterley. So it's bad to misspell the title. This reminds me of a skit by Monty Python called The Bookshop. Let's just listen to a tiny bit of that right now.
Can you help me with David Copperfield?
Ah, yes, Dickens.
No.
I think what?
No, Edmund Wells.
I think you'll find Charles Dickens wrote David Copperfield.
No, Charles Dickens wrote David Copperfield with 2 P's. This is David Copperfield with 1 P by Edmund Wells.
We only have David Copperfield with 2 P's by Charles Dickens.
Pity, it's more thorough than the Dickens.
More thorough?
Yes, I wonder if it's worth having a look through your David Copperfield.
I'm quite sure that all our David Copperfields have 2 P's.
Probably, but the original by Edmund Wells also had 2 P's. It was after that they ran into copyright difficulties.
No, I'm quite sure that all our David Copperfields with 2 P's are by Charles Dickens.
How about Great Expectations?
Ah, yes, we have that.
That's G-R-A-T-E, Expectations. Also by Edmund Wells.
Well, in that case, we don't have it. We don't have anything by Edmund Wells, actually.
I think it could be deliberate, an attempt to say, well, this isn't really Lady Chatterley's Lover, this is Lady Chatterley's Lover. At any rate, here's the book. Let's read a little bit. So anyhow, this book, believe it or not, Lawrence doesn't even attempt to get past the censors until, and it isn't published in a non-edited version until the 1960s. So if you were in the United States, you wouldn't be able to hear this passage. Let's just hear a little bit of this banned book. And you'll see that it is a little bit more direct, a little easier to understand. In the actual sex thrill within the body, the sisters nearly succumbed to the strange male power, but quickly they recovered themselves, took the sex thrill as a sensation, and remained free. Whereas the men, in gratitude to the women for the sex experience, let their souls go out to them, and afterwards looked rather as if they'd lost a shilling and found a sixpence. Lawrence also uses profanity. There's all sorts of things, but much like his friend E.M. Forster, who knew that he couldn't publish Maurice at the time, D.H. Lawrence didn't even try. And so that's what makes this pretty rare and very interesting, and yet another pirated edition. And finally, one last pirated edition, also published in New York, also published about the same time. This one is now 1940, but it was written about the same time. And this is Henry Miller, who wrote The Tropic of Cancer, which is a very famous book about his life and travels. Now, what's interesting about this book is it's under a false imprint by Medusa, which is, I think, hearkening back to Ulysses and sort of Greek mythology. And if you look in the back of this book, you know it's the New York imprint, because look, it says imprinted in Mexico, and that is entirely fake, entirely to get the the Comstocks and others off their tail. This way, but it didn't work. And basically, to this day, Tropic of Cancer is still considered rather profane and controversial. It was not published again until the 1960s. There was a whole nother lawsuit about that. At the time, you know what they said about Tropic of Cancer? It's not a book. It's a cesspool. It's an open sewer. It's a pit of putrefaction. It's a slimy gathering of all that is rotten in the debris of human depravity. That's what Pennsylvania Supreme Court Justice Michael Musamano wrote. Well, that's sad. I think we're just going to have just a little bit of Tropic of Cancer to finish this out here. Here we go. Claude would ask you to turn your face away. All wrong. A man, when he's burning up with passion, wants to see things. He wants to see everything. And while it's all very nice to know that a woman has a mind, literature coming from the cold corpse of a whore is the last thing to be served in bed. Yeah, pretty controversial stuff, but also a classic book. It should be noted that the pirating publishers of each of these books, Olivia, ended up in jail for multiple years. So something is to be said for them, even if they were trying to make a buck without paying the copyright, to the authors. And when we think about fan books today, I think we should think about how risky and how much of a challenge it was, and at least be glad that we don't have the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice raiding our warehouses, because what would they find at the Midtown Scholar warehouse? Quite a few. Okay, we always end with a funny book, Olivia. It was hard to come up with a funny book for banned books, but I did it. This is actually a good book. We should definitely stock this now at the bookstore. It is called Fictitious Dishes, an album of literature's most memorable meals. And what I like about this is, think about your famous literary characters in these banned books, and then think about what meal they would order if they were condemned, to the gallows. And then they reproduce these meals. So it's part cookbook, part literary work. You're not convinced yet? Would you like to see? All right. For Ulysses, here's what we got. And let's zoom in on that beautiful thing, and I'll read you. Mr. Leopold Bloom ate with relish the inner organs of beasts and fowls. He liked thick giblet soup, nutty gizzards, a stuffed roast tart, liver slices fried with crust crumbs, fried hencock roes. Most of all, he liked grilled mutton kidneys, which gave to his palate a fine tang of faintly scented urine. Getting hungry? Well, that is the food inspired by Ulysses. You can read about the food inspired by other banned books. Well, that is another edition of Buy Day Friday. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll watch next Friday and every Friday at noon for more adventures in the world of books.